Okay, so you know how some mysteries really get under your skin?
Yeah.
They stick with you, and you find yourself thinking about them years later.
I know exactly what you mean.
Well, the disappearance of the Sodder children, right after that Christmas Eve fire back in 1945 in Fayetteville, West Virginia. That's one of those for me, for sure.
It is for me too, and it's one of those cases that people just seem to be endlessly fascinated with.
And for good reason. I mean, a family home engulfed in flames and 5 kids just vanish.
Poofed.
Gone.
Yeah.
And here's the part that always gets me.
Right.
No remains, no trace.
Yeah, that's the detail that haunts everyone. I think the fact that there was never any physical evidence of what happened to those children.
Right, and I think that's a big part of why this story still captures our attention decades later.
Oh, absolutely.
So that's actually what we're going to really dig into today in our deep dive. We're not going to rehash the fire itself or the initial investigation. We've done that before.
Right, what happened?
We're going to focus on what came after, because there were all these reports, these sightings of people who thought they saw the missing Sodder children years later in the 1950s and 60s.
Yeah, it's pretty wild.
So that's our mission today. What do we make of these sightings? Are they actual clues that Maurice, Martha Louise Shanny, and Betty, they were 14, 12, 9, 8, and 5 at the time?
Right.
Could they have somehow survived that night, or is this just a case of people seeing what they wanted to see? I mean, were these sightings just tragic coincidences, or even worse, were some of them cruel hoaxes?
Yeah, those are the big questions we're going to be looking at today. The emotional weight of this case is just immense. I mean, the Sodders spent decades searching, clinging to the hope that their children were out there. Every time there was a new sighting, a potential lead, you have to imagine how much that would meant to them.
Absolutely.
Mhm.
So let's start with some of those early reports from the 1950s. There's a pretty well-known account of a woman in a diner in Charleston, West Virginia.
Oh, right, right. Yeah, this one is interesting because it's so brief. It's frustratingly brief. A woman in a Charleston diner. It's, not that far geographically from Fayetteville. She apparently just out of the blue told someone she was talking to that she knew what had happened to the Sodder children.
Wow. Just drop that bombshell.
Yeah, just like that. And think about that for a second. Someone claiming to have knowledge of this horrific event just casually in a diner.
It's chilling. So what happened when the person she was talking to asked for more details?
Well, that's where the story ends, and that's the truly frustrating part. As soon as she was pressed for details, she clammed up, she got quiet, left the diner. It's a dead end. And it just fueled the Sodders' belief that someone out there knew something but was too afraid to come forward.
Yeah, I could see how that would happen. Wait, could you imagine getting that close to a potential break in the case, only to have it disappear like that?
I can only imagine the frustration and the heartbreak it must have caused.
It almost makes you think that maybe there was something more going on,
Hmm.
right? Something bigger than just a tragic accident.
It does make you wonder.
So let's jump ahead now to 1967. We have what I think is probably the most talked about piece of evidence in this whole case, that mysterious letter and the photograph.
Oh, yes, this one is just wild.
It really seemed to reignite public interest in the case. So can you walk us through that?
Sure. So Jenny Sodder, she received this envelope in the mail.
Right. Jenny, one of the Sodder daughters.
Yeah, one of the daughters. And the envelope, it had no return address. And inside was a photograph of a young man who appeared to be in his 30s. And then on the back of the photograph, there was a handwritten note.
And what did that note say?
The note read, Louis Sodder. I love brother Frankie L. Boys, A90132 or 35.
Louis Sodder. So that's one of the missing boys. And the guy in the photo, did he look like Louis?
According to everyone who saw the photo, yes, there was a striking resemblance to what Louis might have looked like as an adult. It wasn't just, a vague similarity. It really seemed like it could be him. And you can imagine the impact that must have had on the Sodders seeing that photo after all those years.
Oh, absolutely. It must have been such a mix of emotions, hope, and probably also fear and confusion.
For sure.
Yeah.
And they took it very seriously. They hired a private investigator to try to track down the sender of the letter and find the man in the photo.
And then the investigator disappears, which just adds another layer to this whole mystery, right?
It does. It really does. It's one of those details that make this case so difficult to get a handle on here. You have a private investigator working on a very sensitive case, a case that has a lot of emotion tied to it, and then he vanishes.
Just gone poof.
It makes you wonder what might have happened. Did he find something that someone didn't want him to find? Did he get too close to the truth and someone silenced him?
It's so unsettling.
It is.
Yeah.
And it's impossible to know for sure, but the fact that it happened, it just fuels the speculation around this case even more.
Right. So we have the woman in the diner, the mysterious letter and photo.
Yeah.
And then later in the late 1960s, we have another sighting, this time a man in Kentucky who reportedly looked a lot like Maurice Sodder.
Yeah, this one is interesting too because Kentucky is obviously not right next door to West Virginia,
Right.
but it's not an impossible distance.
Not at all.
And the reports were very specific. This man looked a lot like what Maurice would have looked like as an adult. A family friend actually went to Kentucky to try to talk to this man to see if it really was Maurice.
Wow, so they took it very seriously.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. But unfortunately, it was another dead end. The man refused to speak to the family friend, and shortly after that, he disappeared from the area.
Oh, wow. So that's similar to the woman in the diner, right?
Yeah.
A brief encounter followed by just vanishing.
Exactly. It's a pattern that we see in a few of these sightings, and it's part of what makes this case so frustrating and so fascinating.
It does make you wonder if maybe at least some of these sightings were legitimate, right? And maybe the children were out there living new lives, but for whatever reason couldn't or wouldn't reconnect with their past.
Yeah, it's certainly a possibility.
So we have all these sightings, these glimmers of hope for the Sodders. But now let's take a step back and look at the big picture. What are some of the main theories that have been put forward to try to explain these events?
Okay, so let's start with the one that's probably the most obvious given the sightings, which is the theory that the children were in fact alive after the fire.
Right, because there are just so many of these sightings that it makes you wonder if there could be some truth to at least some of them.
Yeah, and this theory suggests that the children were taken from the home maybe right before the fire really took hold or during the chaos of that night, and then they were raised by other families.
Kidnapped, essentially.
Right, and the evidence for this lies in those reported resemblances. The photo of the man who looked like Louis, the man in Kentucky who looked like Maurice. If those sightings were accurate, then it really lends credence to the idea that the children survived.
It's a compelling theory, but it does raise one big question. If they were alive, why wouldn't they have tried to contact their parents at some point, especially once they were adults?
That is the million-dollar question, isn't it? It's really hard to understand why someone wouldn't want to reconnect with their family after being separated for so long.
Unless they couldn't.
Right, unless they couldn't. There are a lot of possible reasons for that. Maybe they were too young when they were taken to remember their family. Maybe they were deliberately kept isolated and didn't know the truth about their past. Or maybe, and this is a really tough one to think about, maybe they did remember, but they were afraid to come forward.
That's heartbreaking.
It is. It's hard to even fathom what might have led to that kind of situation, but it's something we have to consider.
So the first theory is that the children survived, were taken and raised by others. The second theory is much darker. The idea that these sightings, the letter, the photo, were all hoaxes.
Yeah, this theory suggests that someone, or maybe multiple people, were deliberately trying to mislead the Sodders and the public.
To what end, though? Why would anyone do that?
Well, there are a few possibilities. Maybe it was a prank that got out of hand, or maybe it was someone seeking attention or notoriety. But there's also the more sinister possibility that someone was trying to cover up what really happened to the children.
Throw people off the scent.
Exactly. And the fact that the private investigator disappeared without a trace, well, that just adds fuel to that theory.
It does. It makes you wonder if he uncovered something he shouldn't have and paid the price for it.
It's chilling to think about.
So the evidence for the hoax theory is mainly the lack of concrete proof that any of these sightings were actually the Sodder children. There was never any definitive identification. And of course, the investigator's disappearance is suspicious.
Right, but the counter-argument to that, particularly when it comes to the 1967 photo, is that it was never proven to be a fake either.
Yeah, no matter how much people scrutinize that photo, they couldn't debunk it.
Exactly, and that makes it really hard to dismiss, and especially when you combine it with the note on the back and the reported resemblance to Louis, it's a very compelling piece of the puzzle.
Okay, so we have the children survive theory, we have the hoax theory, and then there's the official explanation, the one that the authorities have generally stuck to, which is that the children died in the fire and the sightings were just coincidences.
Right. The simplest explanation?
The most straightforward, but also in many ways the most tragic.
Yeah, and the main evidence that gets cited for this is a later claim by the fire chief that he buried some bones at the scene.
But that was never really confirmed, was it?
No, there's no real proof that those bones were ever actually found or that they belonged to the children.
And that brings us to a really crucial point for this theory, the fact that no remains were ever found.
Right. Forensic experts have said that even in a really intense fire, you'd expect to find some bone fragments, especially teeth, which are incredibly durable. The complete absence of any remains is a major problem for the official explanation.
So essentially it boils down to this. If the children died in the fire, where are the bodies?
It's the question that hangs over this entire case.
So with all that in mind, what do you think is the most likely scenario here? Because it feels like we have three main possibilities, and none of them are particularly satisfying.
I think it's hard to completely rule out any of the theories, but to me, the most compelling possibility is that at least some of the sightings were real. The sheer number of them and the specificity of some of the reports, especially the 1967 photograph and the Kentucky encounter, make it hard to just write them all off as mistaken identity or hoaxes.
Yeah, and that photograph especially, it really stands out, doesn't it?
It does. It's a very tangible piece of evidence, and it raises so many questions. Who was that young man? Why send his picture to the Sodders with that strange note?
And is it possible that we could ever actually know the truth? I mean, given all the advances in technology since 1945?
Well, one possibility is DNA testing. If any of the Sodder children survived and had children of their own, then modern DNA testing could potentially link those descendants back to the Sodder family and finally give us some answers.
It's a long shot, but it's not impossible.
Yeah. Right. It would depend on finding those descendants after all these years, which is a huge task, but it's something that could theoretically be done.
It's incredible to think that a mystery from 1945 could still potentially be solved today.
I know it's almost 80 years later and people are still captivated by this case.
So why do you think this story continues to fascinate us so much? What is it about the Sodder children that keeps us coming back?
Well, I think a lot of it has to do with the unknown, with the unanswered questions. The human mind just really hates not knowing. And this case is full of unknowns.
Right, we don't know for sure what happened to the children. We don't know who sent the letter and the photograph. We don't know what happened to the private investigator.
It's a story that's full of holes, and our brains just naturally want to fill those holes in.
And then there's the emotional element of it. The idea of 5 children disappearing without a trace. It's just inherently unsettling, and I think it taps into some primal fears we have about loss and the unknown.
Absolutely. And the fact that it happened around Christmas, a time that's supposed to be about family and togetherness, I think that just adds another layer of tragedy and mystery to the whole thing.
Yeah, it really does. So we've explored the details of this case, the sightings, the theories, the lingering questions, but ultimately the disappearance of the Sodder children remains officially unsolved.
Right. And it's a case that forces us to confront the very real possibility that some mysteries might never be fully solved.
We may never know for sure what happened to those children on that Christmas Eve.
And I think as we wrap up this deep dive, it's important for everyone listening to just sit with that for a moment, to think about what it means to live with uncertainty and not knowing. Imagine being the Sodder parents and living with that, not knowing for years and years, never being able to find closure.
Yeah, that's a really heavy thought.
It is, and it's a reminder that sometimes in life, there are no easy answers. Some questions just linger.
So we want to hear from you, our listeners. What do you find most compelling or most perplexing about this case? Is it the sightings, the theories, the lack of evidence? What part of this story sticks with you the most?
Share your thoughts with us, because even though the official investigation might be closed, the conversation about the Sodder children is clearly far from over.
And it's a conversation that I think will continue for years to come because some mysteries just refuse to die.
I think you're right about that.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into one of the most enduring mysteries in American history. And until next time, keep searching for the truth.
Always keep searching.